To understand America in the last 20 years is to understand a nation in a constant state of reaction. The story begins not in the mid-2000s, but in the lingering shadow of September 11, 2001. By 2004, the country was deep into two foreign wars, in Afghanistan and, more controversially, in Iraq. The national mood was a mixture of patriotic fervor and deep-seated anxiety. This was the era of color-coded terror alerts, of heightened security at airports, of a new federal agency called the Department of Homeland Security. It was the era of the Patriot Act, a piece of legislation that sparked a fierce, enduring debate over the fundamental trade-off between security and liberty. How much freedom was a citizen willing to sacrifice for the promise of safety? This question echoed through the second term of President George W. Bush, who won re-election in 2004 on a platform of strong wartime leadership. But in August of 2005, a different kind of crisis exposed the limits of that leadership. Hurricane Katrina, a catastrophic storm, slammed into the Gulf Coast, overwhelming the levees of New Orleans. The world watched in horror as a major American city descended into chaos. The delayed and inadequate federal response became a searing symbol of governmental failure, laying bare the deep lines of race and class that still fractured the nation. While the nation was distracted by war and disaster, a different kind of storm was brewing in the economy. It was the age of easy credit and the housing boom. The American dream of homeownership seemed more accessible than ever, but it was being fueled by a complex and precarious system of subprime mortgages. A bubble was inflating, silently, to an unprecedented size, and few in power seemed to hear the faint ticking sound before the explosion. Yet, even amidst the turmoil, the seeds of a profound social and technological revolution were being planted. In 2006, a social networking site for college students called Facebook opened its doors to everyone. And in 2007, Apple CEO Steve Jobs stood on a stage and introduced the iPhone, a device that would fundamentally remap human interaction, media, and culture itself. At the time, these were just products. In reality, they were the architects of a future no one could yet fully imagine, a future that would connect and divide America in ways never before seen. The year 2008 was the year the floor fell out. The housing bubble, which had fueled so much apparent prosperity, burst with devastating force. The crisis began in the arcane world of mortgage-backed securities but quickly spread like a contagion through the entire global financial system. In September, the investment bank Lehman Brothers, a 158-year-old titan of Wall Street, declared bankruptcy. The event sent a shockwave of panic across the world. Credit markets froze. The stock market plummeted. The specter of a new Great Depression, once a distant historical memory, suddenly felt terrifyingly real. In response, the U.S. government initiated a series of massive, controversial bailouts, most notably the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP. The government injected hundreds of billions of dollars into the very banks and financial institutions whose risky behavior had caused the crisis. It was a move deemed necessary to prevent total collapse, but to millions of Americans watching their homes lose value and their jobs disappear, it felt like a profound betrayal. The anger and fear that defined this period created a fertile ground for political change. Into this landscape of crisis stepped a young senator from Illinois, Barack Obama. His campaign, built on a message of hopes and change, electrified a nation weary of war and economic anxiety. His election in November 2008 was a watershed moment in American history, the first African American to win the presidency. It felt, for many, like the culmination of a long and arduous civil rights struggle, a powerful affirmation of the country's progress. President Obama inherited a nation on the brink. His first years were dominated by the Great Recession, passing a massive economic stimulus package to stave off a deeper depression. Then came his signature legislative ambition, reforming the nation's healthcare system. The resulting law, the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, passed in 2010. It was the most significant expansion of the social safety net in decades, but it was also one of the most polarizing laws in modern history. The fierce opposition to the bailouts and the healthcare law coalesced into a powerful new political force, the Tea Party movement. It was a grassroots, conservative uprising that championed fiscal responsibility, limited government, and a strict interpretation of the Constitution. This movement reshaped the Republican Party and deepened the partisan chasm that would come to define the next decade of American politics. As America moved into President Obama's second term, the country began a long, slow climb out of the Great Recession. The stock market recovered, unemployment rates gradually fell, and the economy was officially growing again. But the recovery felt different on the ground. For millions, it was a jobless recovery, or one defined by stagnant wages and a widening gap between the wealthy and everyone else. The sense that the system was rigged, a feeling that began during the bank bailouts, hardened into a deep-seated conviction for many. This economic unease was matched by a growing social and cultural friction. The promise of a post-racial America, which some had hoped for after Obama's election, dissolved in the face of persistent, high-profile incidents of racial injustice. The 2013 acquittal of George Zimmerman in the shooting death of teenager Trayvon Martin gave rise to the phrase, "Black Lives Matter." A year later, the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, ignited a new wave of protests and forced a painful, long-overdue national conversation about race, policing, and the justice system. The movement, amplified by social media, ensured that these issues could no longer be ignored. At the same time, the nation experienced a landmark moment for civil rights. In 2015, the Supreme Court case Obergefell v. Hodges affirmed the right to same-sex marriage nationwide. The decision was a triumphant victory for the LGBTQ rights movement, celebrated across the country as a major step toward equality. Yet, these parallel movements, one for racial justice and one for marriage equality, also highlighted the deepening cultural divides. The so-called culture wars intensified, with fierce debates over identity, religion, and the very definition of American values playing out in communities and online. In Washington, this division manifested as political gridlock. The partisan animosity that began with the Tea Party's rise had solidified into a state of near-permanent legislative warfare. The optimism of 2008 had curdled into a pervasive cynicism. The political establishment of both parties seemed increasingly out of touch with the anger and frustration simmering across the country. Abroad, the rise of a new threat, ISIS, pulled America back into the complexities of the Middle East. The nation was healing economically, but it was fracturing socially and politically, creating a volatile atmosphere that was ripe for a political earthquake. The presidential election of 2016 was not just a political contest, it was a cultural collision. It pitted Hillary Clinton, a former First Lady, Senator, and Secretary of State, the embodiment of the political establishment, against Donald Trump, a billionaire real estate developer and reality television star who had never held public office. Trump's campaign defied every convention of modern politics. With his populist, nationalist slogan, "Make America Great Again," he tapped into a deep well of resentment among voters who felt left behind by globalization, ignored by the political elites, and threatened by cultural change. His victory on election night was a political shockwave that reverberated across the globe. It was a stunning repudiation of the establishment and a clear signal that the old rules no longer applied. The Trump presidency was defined by a single, overarching principle for disruption. His administration moved swiftly to roll back regulations, pass a major tax cut, and appoint a record number of conservative judges to federal courts, including 3 to the Supreme Court. His America First foreign policy upended decades of international consensus. He initiated a trade war with China, withdrew the United States from the Paris Agreement on climate change and the Iran nuclear deal, and challenged alliances like NATO. His presidency was also marked by constant controversy and a relentless pace of news. Investigations into Russian interference in the 2016 election consumed much of his first 2 years, culminating in a report by special counsel Robert Mueller and, ultimately, his first impeachment by the House of Representatives for his dealings with Ukraine. While Washington was consumed by political battles, a powerful social reckoning was unfolding across the country. In late 2017, the #Me Too movement erupted, exposing widespread sexual harassment and assault in Hollywood, media, politics, and beyond. It empowered countless women to speak out, toppled powerful men, and forced a fundamental re-examination of gender dynamics and power imbalances in the workplace. This era was supercharged by social media, which had become the central arena for public discourse. It was an indispensable tool for social movements like #MeToo, but it also became a powerful engine of polarization. Partisan media ecosystems and the rampant spread of misinformation created alternate realities, making it seem as if Americans were no longer just disagreeing on policy, but on basic facts. The nation, more connected than ever, felt more divided than at any point in modern memory. The year 2020 arrived to a nation already on edge, but no one could have predicted the series of cascading crises that would push it to the brink. In the early months, a novel coronavirus, COVID-19, began its silent spread across the globe. By March, it had brought the United States to a standstill. Businesses shuttered, schools closed, and millions were confined to their homes. The pandemic was a once-in-a-century public health catastrophe that would ultimately claim over 1 million American lives. It triggered an economic collapse rivaling the Great Depression and exposed the fragility of the nation's healthcare system and supply chains. The crisis also became intensely politicized, with bitter public battles erupting over masks, lockdowns, and eventually, vaccines, turning public health measures into another front in the ongoing culture war. In the midst of this national trauma, on May 25, 2020, a video emerged from Minneapolis showing the murder of George Floyd, an unarmed black man, by a white police officer. The footage sparked a wave of grief and rage that ignited the largest protest movement in the country's history. For months, in cities large and small, hundreds of thousands of Americans of all races marched to demand an end to systemic racism and police brutality. It was a profound and painful reckoning with America's past and present. This all formed the backdrop for one of the most consequential presidential elections in history. The 2020 contest between Donald Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden saw record voter turnout, despite the pandemic. Biden's victory was decisive, but it was immediately met with an unprecedented campaign by the incumbent president to overturn the results, based on baseless claims of widespread fraud. This campaign culminated on January 6, 2021, when a mob of supporters, incited by the president, stormed the U.S. Capitol in an attempt to stop the certification of the election. The violent assault on the heart of American democracy was a shocking spectacle broadcast to the world, a moment that crystallized the profound fragility of the nation's political institutions. Joe Biden inherited a country scarred by plague, protest, and political insurrection. His presidency has been a struggle to navigate these deep wounds while confronting new challenges: historic inflation, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the accelerating threat of climate change. The last 20 years have been a journey through war, economic collapse, technological revolution, and social upheaval. It has been a period that has fundamentally tested America's identity, its resilience, and the very viability of its democratic experiment, leaving it at a crossroads, profoundly changed and uncertain of the path ahead.